Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome to an in-between episode where I answer any question that you have about history. Today's question is this: what are some of the biggest mistranslations in history? Well, for me personally, as somebody who has worked in some translation work between English and Turkish, I can tell you that mistranslations can get you in a lot of trouble. To give you a short story, a friend of mine was visiting. He was at a restaurant with me, and he wanted to say thank you to the waiter after he brought him the bill. He said to me, "How do you say that?" I said, "Oh, teşekkürler." That's a kind of a semi-formal version or a way to do it. He said, "Okay, sounds easy enough." So he shouted to the waiter with everyone in earshot, "Teşekkürler." Everyone in the restaurant turned at him, shocked. He said to me, "Why is everybody looking at me so strangely? I just said thank you." I said to him, "No, my friend, you did not say thank you. You just shouted to everyone in the restaurant, 'Testicles!' That's a short example. Now, we were not heads of state. We were not hammering out a diplomatic treaty or a nuclear arms treaty. If we were, and there were a mistranslation like that, imagine how many problems there could be. Well, there was a mistranslation that while it didn't start a war, it heavily inflamed Cold War animosity between America and the Soviet Union. More generally, the American bloc and the Soviet bloc. Here's what happened. In 1956, the Cold War was in full swing, and there was an arms race that was really starting to heat up between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nikita Khruschev, the Soviet premier, was addressing Western ambassadors at a reception at the Polish embassy in Moscow. He said this: "About the capitalist states, it doesn't depend on you whether or not we exist. If you don't like us, don't accept our invitations, and don't invite us to come see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." Then with the image of him pounding his shoe on the podium. Because of this rant, the envoys from 12 NATO nations and Israel left the room. To follow up, in a subsequent speech, Khrushchev declared, "We must take a shovel and dig a deep grave and bury colonialism as deep as we can." In a 1961 speech at the Institute of Marxism-Leninism in Moscow, Khrushchev said that peaceful coexistence for the Soviet Union means intense economic, political, and ideological struggle between the proletariat and the aggressive forces of imperialism in the world arena. Now, these are incendiary remarks, of course, "we will bury you," but this came right on the heels of the Soviets just successfully testing an H-bomb, which made it sound like they had their weapons aimed right at the United States and were ready to detonate at any time. A few years later, of course, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's a lot of firepower behind these words. The American media piled on the statement and, in order to stand as an act of defiance, called Khrushchev a red-faced and gesticulating windbag. And of course, Khrushchev and the United States had the nuclear armament to destroy the entire world. Now, it turns out that Khrushchev didn't actually say, "we will bury you." A few years later, he tried to correct the record. And for him to correct the record is quite notable because Khrushchev really tried to project a tough image. Privately, he denounced the actions of Joseph Stalin and imprisoning thousands of innocent people, but he never publicly apologized for Stalinization and Stalin-esque political programs. So for him to try to add context to these words shows that he took this mistranslation or misunderstanding very seriously. What he was using was a pretty common saying in Soviet Russia. What he really meant to say was, "We will outlast you." He was using posturing that communism was better than capitalism, and the forces of communism and the march of history in the usual Marxist-Leninist framework says that the gears of history move in such a way that communism is simply inevitable, and there is a self-destruct sequence programmed into capitalism wherever it goes. But because of this misinterpretation, Americans thought Khrushchev was threatening to literally bury the United States in a rubble of a nuclear attack. And then in the next year, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, so there is a satellite hovering over the Earth, and the Soviet Union isn't too far away from building a larger satellite that could perhaps deploy a nuclear weapon. Now, here is how Khrushchev tries to qualify the remarks. In 1963, Khrushchev remarked in a speech in Yugoslavia, "I once said, 'We will bury you,' and I got into trouble with it. Of course we will not bury you with a shovel. Your own working class will bury you." And this is a reference to the Marxist saying, "The proletariat is the undertaker of capitalism." This is based on the concluding statement in Chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto, which says, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." Khrushchev also expressed this Marxist thesis at a meeting with journalists in the United States in September 1959. And Americans, again, interpreted the quote as a nuclear threat. Other authors say that a better translation of the phrase, "we will bury you," is, "we shall be present at your funeral," or "we shall outlive you." The idea that Russia would take care of the funeral arrangements for capitalism after its demise, not that Russia would be the assassin of capitalism. Now, of course, Khrushchev didn't help by his rather strong dramatic stage presence. His daughter said later that he was known for strong language, interrupting speakers, banging his fists on the table in protest, pounding his feet, even whistling. She described such behavior as a manner which suited his goal: to be different from the hypocrites of the West with their appropriate words but calculated deeds. So there you are, strong words from Khrushchev, but not exactly threatening nuclear annihilation. So the next time you're translating words from one language to another, please choose your words carefully. Well, thank you for the question. If any of you would like to submit one to me, you can do so by going to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. There you'll find instructions, and I'll be glad to answer anything that you can throw at me. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. You can do that by going to historyonthenet.com/subscribe. Speaking of history on the net, if you want to dive deeper, go to our site historyonthenet.com, and there you'll find blog posts, book reviews, and all of our other podcast episodes. Plus, don't forget to rate and review this podcast so we can bring you the best daily history content possible. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.